So all my prison life, first as a governor, and then later when I joined the NHS, I wanted to work at Grendon because, again, I think focused on this statement of purpose. For me, therapeutic prisons have a particular role in managing that tension. And I really wanted to be part of an organisation that looked on treating crime, particularly violent crime, as a sort of the clinical model, a social model, psychosocial fit. That's the only prison that actually states that fully up front, or at least it was.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So Mary Hayley was until very recently Head of Psychotherapy at HMP Grendon, the only fully therapeutic prison in the UK, which, incidentally, celebrates its 60th anniversary in 2022. We're very pleased to be talking with Mary because she has an unusual career pathway, working in different roles within the prison service. Hi, Mary.
Hi, David. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Mary. Really delighted you're able to join us today, so really good to get to have a proper conversation with you. Mary, could you tell us about yourself and how you came to be working in prisons?
Well, if I go right back to school, my headmistress told me I'd end up in prison. I just don't think she ever expected me to have keys when I was there. But literally, it was quite a checkered youth, and I really only started to look at a career after I'd had my child and thought I'd go into I thought I would move away from the commercial world. I'd had several jobs and I knew that I wanted to work in the public sector. I looked at probation, I looked at social work, and I don't know, prisons just had a draw for me. There were lots of people there. Many of them wanted to make changes to their life. Some of them very angry, but there was just people. You go into work every day and see people that wanted to do something different. And I don't know, I just got involved with it that way, really, wanting to be part of making a difference.
What were you doing beforehand that made you think you wanted to do something very different?
Well, for lots of years I was a secretary, in the days where people would put their arms around you and say, there, sweetie, go make the tea. And I thought there's got to be more to life than this. I taught English in Sicily for a while, and that was great. But I was homesick, and I just thought, no, I need to go and do further education and actually get a career and have something with a purpose to it, really.
The fact that you taught English in Sicily might suggest that you're good at pushing yourself outside your comfort zone. It's not a natural career for many British people, is it?
Thank you. I mean, you don't think about that. You never think about yourself, do you, as something outside the norm, because it is the norm for you. So I'd never really thought about it till you said that. But yeah, I think you're right. I am pushy.
Well, I think you must have had a sense of adventure about you to take the risk of doing that and leaving everything that was familiar to do that. But you mentioned that you studied literature and philosophy at university. How did that prepare you for subsequent work?
I loved the course. It was, again, doing something I wanted to do. So I think that in itself was part of it, realizing that you can actually put a lot more work in if it doesn't feel like work. Philosophy was, well, literature was really just enjoyable. But the philosophy really taught you about how one argument can be as good as another, how people often used powers of persuasion rather than logical argument, how people can get absolutely drawn into the various myths that are around in their life and believe them as fact. And that was really important in prisons, I think, because the I'm born to hate society, I'm born to be violent, it's just a myth that somebody tells himself. One of my phrases to men in therapy quite often was, there's no cat A babies. Now, there might be an embryonic cat A baby at age about 12 months when bad things have happened. So I think philosophy was really very much of, you can look with a blank piece of paper, and it doesn't have to be the way it always has been.
It's really interesting to think of it like that, because I think one of the concepts that the prison service is fond of talking about is new me, isn't it? But I think actually sometimes it can be more helpful to talk about the real you that you are destined to become, rather than have to reinvent yourself as a whole individual.
Absolutely. And in fact, the term new me really gets me quite annoyed, because I think, no, actually, old you kept you alive in very skewed and very damaging and very hurtful ways at times, but you were doing the best you could. And rather than say, I want to be new me, I think it's much more helpful to say, thank you, old me, made some mistakes, I'll take it from here. And another thing that I think is really important about not saying old me was bad, old me is still me. So how can I trust myself to make the changes I want to make if the person who did things in the past is totally untrustworthy? So I think it has to be, I was doing my best rather than that was a different person.
I really like that way of looking at things as well, because I think what you're highlighting is how often we can end up writing people off because they've done something awful and they're in prison, and yet we know when we work in prisons that we see moments of real kindness, humanity, real generosity of spirit in prison. We don't just see things that are frightening and disgusting, do we?
Absolutely. And I also find it almost psychotic that a sort of mob approach to some of the media stories. Do you remember you see these awful stories about children who've been abused and killed. And I can remember somebody saying quite high up in the prison service, if that baby, that toddler had survived, you'd have probably been baying for his breath, the awful things he'd done. And actually, we as a society, I think we all have a responsibility for people not to become violent when they're tiny.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And so you explained that you trained and worked as a prison officer later on than some people might have joined prison service. Was the culture an easy one to fit into after working as a secretary and teaching languages?
Um, yeah, it was different. In those days, male and female prisons were totally separate. Um, so being the ripe old age of over 24, I only did 3 months as a prison officer, not a year. So it was kind of whirlwind tour. So I did nights, I did escort duty, working in kitchens and things. And it was interesting. I mean, even in those early days, you got the splitting. I can remember one prison officer, female, that I was introduced to, and she shook hands with me. And then they said she's a trainee governor, and she spat on her hand and wiped it. But then again, she was lovely in the end, and nearly all of the others as well were very warm and supportive. I think being in an all-female prison as well was the first time I'd worked in an environment that wasn't dominated by men, although most of the governors were men in those days. So it was different. It was nice. I got my first experience of a prisoner trying to groom me too, saying, could I bring some shoes in and leave them with the distressed prisoner's clothing so she could get them and wear them for court? No, I can't do that. I spoke to somebody. So, yeah, it was different.
You've also worked in establishments for male prisoners as well, haven't you? You've not
Oh,
only
yeah.
worked in women's prisons, and I think you probably spent longer working in prisons for men than prisons for women.
The only time that I was in a women's prison was during that training for 3 months. Although I spent some time with Women's Policy Group, but nearly all of my working experience has been adult male prisons.
So what was it like working as a woman in the prison system in those days? You know, do you think it carried any additional challenges as a female staff member?
Yes, and we're going way back into the mid 1980s here. I think it was just something you coped with because that's how life was. And I found that most of my male colleagues would either be protective or dismissive. The fact that I'm really short didn't help either. I could almost feel people patting you on the head. Oh, well done, so you've done something. So, and I noticed I used to sit down a lot at meetings or rest on a table because I noticed if I was with a group of male governors who were talking, they would talk to each other and I'd get left out. And they weren't meaning to, but it just made a difference. And female governors were very supportive of each other. There were so few of us. But I do remember one person who seemed to, I don't know, have a real problem working with male governors. And she said to me one day, "Have you been blooded yet?" I said, "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" And she talked about fox hunting to get kids used to it. And to this day, I don't know what she meant. But generally speaking, I think there were good, supportive colleagues, but they were of their time and would be thinking women weren't quite up to the job as much, and surprised if you were, but happy for you if you were.
And do you think the culture's changed a lot over the time that you've been involved in prisons?
Certainly in terms of male and female gender, yes, because they're much more mixed. And in terms of general culture, well, yes, it's definitely changed. You only have to look at newspaper articles about problems in prison with spice and drones bringing things in. But I have to say, taking the long view and looking at it, I don't think the prison service has ever stopped changing. It's always been changing, and it's been something of a pendulum. Sort of security is more important and rehabilitation's more important. Oh no, rehabilitation's more important, and it's nearly always in a reaction to something that's happened. This prison service's statement of purpose is 2 paragraphs. One, our duty is to look after, to keep in custody those committed by the courts, and 2, to help them to lead law-abiding lives inside and outside, treat with humanity. And if you think about it, I think those 2 things at their polar extremes are mutually exclusive. You keep people in custody. If you don't worry about any human rights, that's a doddle. You can engender self-development and growth, but that attaches huge risks to it. And I think the job of the prison service is to manage the tension between those 2. And that's why I think it does move from one to another over time. At the moment, we've had way back austerity, which obviously had an impact on public sector. Then, of course, we've had the pandemic with how people feel aggrieved. We've got having to make up money for that. And that usually leads to a much more focus on the first paragraph. We keep people in custody, forgetting that vast majority come out and we have to then stop them going in. So, yeah, it's changed, but I think it will change again.
A lot seems to me to depend upon the kind of current political climate and how divided society is. And the more divided society is, then the more likely a group of politicians will be to look round for scapegoats, and the prison service, or prisoners at any rate, are often quite a handy target in that respect. But anyway,
you might say that, David. I couldn't possibly comment.
Thank you. Almost 20, I think it was almost 20 years ago anyway, you had a major career change. Can you tell us about that and why you did it?
Um, yeah, actually, I didn't have a major career change. I had a major career staying the same when all around me was changing. Governors in the old days used to be much more like caseworkers, those based in prisons and to take responsibility. Now, back in 1988, that changed, and governors, quite rightly, became responsible for their prisons and line management throughout their prison and for the prison budgets, as opposed to just getting more money from the treasury each time. So we became, say we, as I was then, much more managers of prisons and prison departments. Now, I think that was the right step for the prison service, but it wasn't the right step for me. I joined to be more of that, as I say, I looked at social work, I looked at probation. So I gave it a go and it was all right. Um, but as time went on, I thought this isn't what I want. And once my personal circumstances allowed me to cut back from work and work part time, I looked at training. Do I train psychology? Do I train social work again, or psychotherapy? And psychotherapy seemed the one for me. Um, so it was actually trying to keep doing the work I had enjoyed. I must admit, I didn't expect to come back in prisons. I just thought, okay, it won't be prisons anymore. I'll work as a psychotherapist and see where that takes me. But like any walk of life, where you've got your expertise and your experience, that's where you get offered the work. So yeah, uh, it was actually trying to stay the same rather than I need to change my career.
Well, that's a very interesting take on it, Mary. I haven't heard it put in those terms before, but I'm sure you're right, because the earliest governors that I can remember, well, there was a chap called Adrian Arnold who was around when I was a young man, and working in the Simon community, and he was very involved with projects like the Simon community, and then of course Tim Newell. When I went to Grendon, first of all, they were very much in the kind of mould that I think you were referring to, but they were obviously the last of a string. We wanted to say something about the role of the wing therapist.
Absolutely, yeah. As I said, I had planned to sort of stay doing casework, and within that, I trained as a psychotherapist. But in fact, I found psychotherapy training, obviously, in hindsight, to be a lot more complex. There's a much deeper emphasis on who the person is, and particularly on the unconscious, and a huge emphasis on the fact of how important our unconscious is. We unconsciously do driving, shopping, gardening. In fact, when you think about it, there's a massive commercial organization about mindfulness, just proving to us how active the unconscious is all the time. In the case of violent offenders, they're avoiding, like anything, the conscious thought. And they certainly don't want to confront the defenses that they unconsciously nurtured and sometimes for decades. What I'll also say, though, working in such a practical organization as the prison service, there's a lot of jargon around psychoanalytic thought. And if I'm really honest, some so called exponents who hide behind a lot of that jargon. But basically, what it is saying that we are massively impacted by our unconscious 24/7. And it really is 24/7 because that includes our dreams as well. Um, and I mean, one of the examples I remember giving to prisoners is to show how affected you are by your unconscious. Is if you're feeling ratty, you've had a bad parole review or a bad visit, somebody knocks into you with a cup of tea, you're furious with them. But the same thing can happen. And if you're feeling really good, you've got a parole, oh, watch it next time, mate. Totally the same incident, but it's what we bring to it. And we don't know that in that moment, the time. And of course, it is moment to moment. And what the wing therapist is doing is trying to all the time spin those plates of helping people see their unconscious in action, confront it, press pause, look at it. And it's not just in groups or even helping other facilitators to see what's on in groups. It's all the wing dynamics, including some real anti-group dynamics that can be going on by prisoners at times in their efforts to avoid it. So that in itself is enough. But there's also quite a focus from other people on the wing therapists to make it okay, make this right, sort it out. And of course, that's impossible. And if that wasn't impossible anyway, just because of the vastness of it and the variables of it, but there isn't actually that legitimate power to do some of the things that are wanted. Sort out the staffing levels, stop me going on escort, sort out staffing shortages, sick absences, find me a space to do supervision. All of these things are not within the power. There's some negotiation and influence in some of it, but it's asking the impossible, because again, that's what makes us feel safe. Prisoners at the same time.
But can we talk?
Sorry.
Can we talk a bit about? Can we talk a bit about power? You've mentioned power, and to me, in my mind, power is a very important part of the role of a wing therapist. It's the recognition of power and where power lies, but it's also the exercise of a kind of power which is sort of intangible or ineffable. And I think that's what you were just referring to, as the exercise of this ineffable power, which is mostly to do with containment of people's anxieties and enabling them to take actions on their own. That seems to me to be very much a part of the ring therapist role.
I think you're absolutely right. And the immediate Shakespearean phrase came to mind, some have greatness thrust upon them, aka power. And it is about trying to contain anxieties, or perhaps more accurately, trying to help people contain their own anxieties. And that really is the role of the wing therapist. And within that, they do have a level of power in they have a greater say in which prisoner may or may not stay on the wing, but it's very limited in the actual execution of that, because if you can't transfer a prisoner out, they have to stay, and then you have to continue trying to contain those anxieties. And as I said, people look to the wing therapist to make it better. So there's a huge temptation sort of not to, well, a need as well, not to show some of those anxieties, but actually to show some of them too, to be able to model that this is something doable, but it's not something completely resolvable. We learn to manage those emotions and manage that anxiety whilst doing what we can do, but recognizing the things we can't. So it's a very difficult power, because it doesn't come with many legitimate activities of who's going to be your member of staff, which prisoners will stay and go. And you're trying to do that modeling the one of the four pillars of democracy. And of course, being a human being and getting absolutely drained and fed up and angry within all of that, and trying to contain your own emotions. So a difficult task.
Well, it is very difficult, I think, because the other thing that I think you need to bring as a sort of leader in that group is you need to retain your own creativity and to bring that along to the team, and then to be strong enough and brave enough to foster the creativity and the leadership capacity of every other member of the team, as well. And it's quite difficult to do that if at the same time you're feeling under threat in your own role, of course.
Very much so. And I think creativity, innovation is the heart of what a wing therapist wants to bring to their wing. They want to feel free to help people express themselves and to find their own potential. I mean, a therapeutic community is all about helping people to find their own potential, and that's their side of the statement of purpose, to go on and lead useful and law-abiding lives. And you can't do that if all you're doing is following rules. You have to find a way to be yourself in the world and be okay with what you can't do and okay with what you can do. So, yeah, and everyone will do that their own way. If I think about Grendon, each one of the wing therapists has a very different way of doing it, and that's their strengths. But they need to be supported in having the courage to bring that creativity to their wing, and not to make it competitive as well, not one wing against another, but actually together we're stronger, and that's the way forward. And I mean, that's what makes it so challenging and draining and wonderful. And it is that balance. And we need clinical staff, wing therapists, and governor grades to be recognizing each other's strengths and roles and working together, because those two sides of the coin are fantastic. I mean, I think we said the prison service goes from rehabilitation to security all the time. It's so important to remember that 90% of prisoners will be released into the community. If we're not doing our bit to empower them to take their place, we're just storing up trouble for society.
Brilliant. I think that's put it very well. I used to love being a wing therapist. I think it's an enormously complicated and multi-layered job, but it's fascinating. And I think what you're saying also is that you have to always work closely and in relation to the operational team who provide the kind of physical safety and containment to the whole unit.
Definitely.
So, after training as a psychotherapist and staying the same as you always were, apparently, you worked as an inreach psychotherapist at a high security prison. What was that like?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was seeing people to do individual psychotherapy once a week. So there's two aspects to it, really. There was the clinical work, which was really good. Although I must admit, thinking, oh, I've got this. I've been in prisons for years, and now I'm a super qualified psychotherapist, so I'll be able to work in prison. Great. In fact, I just felt huge role conflict, and I didn't know what to do, and I felt completely de-skilled and didn't have a clue where I was going. I was almost apologetic for A, having been a governor, and B, having the audacity to call myself a psychotherapist. So I felt really not in a good place at all. But you get used to it, and the work was good. The work was similar to stuff I'd been doing, and it was really good to see people begin to trust you. It was interesting as well that sometimes people would trust me because I was a member of the NHS as opposed to a member of the prison service, even though I was exactly the same person. So that was interesting. But I also found it was very different working for the NHS as it was for the prison service. And for me, that wasn't a difference that I found very comfortable. I think because I'd spent so many years in the prison service, but I found it very difficult to cope with the kind of the trust base that was, each trust was a different organization, and that they were multifaceted. And I found, I mean, the other people there were at ease with this. So I'm not criticizing the NHS, but for me, it felt much more diverse and fragmented, and different departments doing totally different things from one another. So you'd have your acute wards that I could go and work on, or you could have the prisons, or there could be there was eating disorder wards, there was general acute wards, there was severe and enduring problems. They were all sort of lumped under the same, and I found it quite difficult to get my head around. I also found the system of commissioning services something quite arcane and esoteric to me. I mean, again, people there understood it, but for me, I found it not something that I was familiar with. And I think the worst part about it was the system of bidding. You would just get a new contract, whether you were, a trust or a sort of different private sector, and you'd be okay. And then before long, you started to having to look at when the contract came up and what else you would do, and how do we make this more cost effective. So I found it quite alien, actually. So although the people were lovely, the work, we were all doing the same work, but there seemed very different ways of doing it. And also, I think I was used to being a governor. So if a governor wanted to see some of our files, people would be angry at that. And I think they're right to. But in my heart, I was thinking, but a governor has to be involved with things. So there really was quite a cultural role conflict in there as well. So yeah, it was okay, but I'm glad I did it. So I'm glad to be back in the prison service.
So you're referring there to the confidentiality which the NHS quite rightly preserves for its work. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess for me, I was used to it's. I think it does need sorting out, actually, because you cannot have absolute confidentiality and absolute responsibility in two different areas. It needs to be said to governors, you've got this, and that's where the boundary. If you're going to have NHS staff, which of course when I joined we never did have, but if they are going to be part about it, then those sorts of areas, demarcation, has to happen, I think. And I don't think it's been thought about.
When I worked for the NHS in prisons, it took me a while to understand that I was seen as being different. So of course I worked for the prison service while I was at Grendon, and in a way you were all in it together. And I thought it would be the same when I worked for the NHS at Gartree, but every now and again the veneer would wear thin, and I realised that actually the prison service bit didn't trust me 100%. They trusted me about 75%.
Yeah, I
And
think
vice
even
versa.
but I think even, for instance, on pathway services, which are mainly, the bigger sum of money comes from the NHS. But as a NHS employer, you're very much, there isn't you are made to feel like you are an outsider that's being lent some trust, and not necessarily as an equal partner within those projects. But you're also highlighting, Mary, the problems around commissioning within the NHS, which, I accept that the people you're working with might not have had that reaction, but people working in all sorts of services across the NHS talk about the impact of, introducing market forces and commissioning, and what impact that has on the NHS, and the amount of energy that is involved then in tendering and re-tendering for services.
Okay, so was it in 2015 that you moved from Whitemoor to Grendon, where you became head of psychotherapy? Was that the same kind of job? How did it differ?
Massively. I guess, I have to acknowledge, first thing, I felt I'd come home. back in the service. It was a
Sorry,
world.
can you just say a bit more about that? You thought you'd come home to the
I
service.
I I'd worked for 17, 18 years in the prison service. It was so familiar to me. It felt like I'd been um, working abroad by working in the NHS. So I came home then, and things have changed a bit. My role was different, but I was used to the systems, the processes, all of that were just so easy. It's like muscle memory in a way. You just come back to what you're used to. So there was that about it, um, and I knew some of the people as well, so that was nice too. But the role of head of psychotherapy was not fully defined, I think, at first. But I think we worked through it, and it was sort of the clinical role, the professional head, not sort of line managing other people. Um, and I saw it as being responsible for um, making sure that the clinical work in Grendon could work as best as it can together with the operational staff. Um, Having been an operational governor and now being a member of clinical staff, what I wanted most of all was for people to help people recognize that they're two sides of the same coin. Back to those two, statement of purpose paragraphs. We can't do the therapy if we haven't got the security of the prison, and both are needed to make it work. So for me, it was about trying to make sure that I did everything I could to de-jargonize anything to do with clinical work, and to help us all work in the same way together. Still doing that now, actually. But yeah, so that was it. Plus, I really enjoyed back in the clinical side of things.
So, was it easy to do that particular task?
God,
Because I
God,
mean,
of course it was. That was week one, David. No, of course not. It's an ongoing process all the time. Um, and I'm not saying that I'm some kind of, you know, hero figure that comes in and do it. People are people, and you get focused on what is your immediate thing. And I think that's kind of part of the role of psychotherapists within to take that step back. What's going on here? Why is there some disharmony here? And reminding ourselves of that. And why am I part of it? Don't get me wrong. Again, I could be fed up. I was going to swear then with what's going on, and angry about different things, different people, with different people, and they with me. Who the hell does she think she is doing all this sort of thing? It's it's not easy, but thank God it isn't, because that's what makes it challenging. That's what keeps it alive. That what makes you need to take a break, but also glad to come back again. So yeah, it's ongoing, and it will always be ongoing forever.
so what was it that appealed to you about working at Grendon? I presume it wasn't just having a job in the prison service; it was more than that.
Do you know what? The first time Grendon was mentioned to me was right back working in as a trainee prison officer, and the governor said to me, "Oh, and you'll have heard of Grendon." I said, "No," and he said to me what it was, and I just thought, "Oh my God, that sounds amazing! I really want to do that." So all my prison life, first as a governor, and then later when I joined the NHS, I wanted to work at Grendon because, again, I think focused on this statement of purpose. For me, therapeutic prisons have a particular role in managing that tension. And I really wanted to be part of an organization that looked on treating crime, particularly violent crime, as a sort of not medical model, but a clinical model, social model. It's not a medical, it's a social one. It's a biosocial sphere, that psychosocial sphere. That's the only prison that actually states that fully up front, or at least it was. So that's why I wanted to work at Grendon.
Thank you. So what would you say, thinking about yourself now, what would you say is your underlying approach or your model? What do you bring to the work?
Okay, before I answer that, though, you asked me about Grendon, the last question. I really think it's vital to say, at the time, there was only Grendon. There's several other places now, including Send, which has a therapeutic community for women. And I delight that we've got more of them. And I think it's really important. And I'm delighted we've got one for women. And I think, that whole thing is important. So I don't want to come away from this interview just thinking about Grendon. I think it's TCs in prisons that need to be focused on. So back to me. What was the question again? Sorry.
Well, actually, this whole podcast is focusing on you, Mary, rather than Grendon or prisons. But I was wondering what your particular style was, what model you use in your work.
I got to be clinically informed. And for me, that is attachment theory more than anything. It's the idea that comes back to there's no cat A babies. Whilst I'm absolutely, 100% wedded to the there's a nature part of us. I think environment has a massive role to play. So for me, the clinical model is that attachment, our significant others, how we learn to protect ourselves, and how we then learn to explore and socially grow into the rest of the world. So that's the clinical knowledge, and I think that's the most important. But beyond that, I think an underlying belief that everybody should have mutual respect for each other doesn't always happen. So I should respect what the governor's job is. I should respect what the prison officer's job is. I should respect the prisoner who's had the courage to come and try and do something. And I should respect the prisoner who hasn't had that courage yet. So, and I expect respect from them, from me as well. So I think there's that clinical model, if you like, but there's that total belief in mutual respect is where we should go.
Thank you. Whilst you're talking, I was thinking that in practically every prison, underneath where it says we're an equal opportunities employer and say no to racism, it might say we work in a relational way or something like that. Do you understand what that means, that latter cliche?
I've got my understanding of it. I don't know if that means I got it right. But I think for me, it links to what I've said, mutual respect, that we are always in relationship with somebody. From the moment you're conceived, you're in a relationship with who your mother is and what she's going through. So you're never not in relationship with somebody, whether she's this mother who you're the pregnant, the fetus of, is happy or being hurt. You are there when she comes out. If she's busy, if she's happy, if your family, if you're accepted at school or not accepted, you are always in relation. And I think to not see people in relationship and to recognize that has an impact, whether you recognize it has an impact or not, we are always in relation. So for me, a relational prison is one that does recognize we have an impact and tries to work within that. So that's what I think it means.
Thank you.
So, Mary, what part of your work have you enjoyed the most? Because I think working as a psychotherapist, there can be the assumption that you're only doing psychotherapy all day long, but my guess is you're doing lots of different aspects of work in that role.
Yeah, I love the people I work with, and I'm talking staff and prisoners. So, and I don't just say that as a nice to say. If you're going to a place where people are miserable all day long. It doesn't matter how good the work is. So for me, working with people that I like and respect is vitally important. Okay, this is going to sound really weird. I love writing end of therapy reports. Um,
Yes, it does.
I mean, most of the men I've written them on will tell you I take far too long writing them. But for me, one of the things I think being in therapy in a prison can give people is some kind of coherent narrative of their life that they may not have had before. So trying to work with them and produce, this is who we saw you are, and this is what you did with us. And there's where we're saying is what we think is useful for you now. And I always try and write it in tandem with them. If I disagree factually with somebody, we'll check the facts. But if I disagree about something they say, they felt this and I thought it was something else, I will just put in the two things. I won't change it, but I won't not acknowledge them. So I think being able to sum up for somebody their time in therapy and pre-therapy is a joy. I love creativity, and I see that as partly creative. But I love, let's have new ideas on things. Let's try this. Let's try that. So
I
I've just
think,
got
Mary,
to.
when you were talking about the reports, there's something quite therapeutic about them, isn't there? You know, if we understand that people's trauma and recovery from that is how people are met in their trauma, I think when you're writing a report, you're actually offering something that's therapeutically valuable. It isn't just although, I mean, I was joking about the you must be crazy to say that because they take so long to write these reports, but actually there is something really powerful about a well-written report.
And I think sometimes when somebody has had hugely chaotic life, it's really quite calming to be able to sit around. The other side of that, though, is you need to kind of warn people that you're going to be saying in very professional, clinical sounding words some horrible things they've gone through. And so saying to people beforehand, I apologize, this might not be easy reading, is important too. But it's helping them confront it as well.
And so, I mean, aside from being a prison officer, obviously you've been a prison governor and also a psychotherapist. They're very significant roles, aren't they, in terms of the prison system, very present. How do the roles differ, and how do you understand the tensions between them? How have you managed that, and is that different because you've tackled them in that order? Might things be different if you'd been I mean, there are psychologists who train as governors, aren't there?
I think any relevant experience you can bring to the role is good. I don't know about what order matters. I think the role of prison governor is huge. I keep thinking of it as having far too many plates to spin, and that so, and sometimes your attention has to go deep down and look at something, but for a lot of the time it's everywhere, and that's why you need a good team around you. But for me, it's total responsibility for the whole prison if you're governor, or you're part of it if um, you know, head of residence, head of security, whatever. But there's so many more. I mean, a prison is a mini society, so there's so many different things to look at. And as you mentioned before, can be very politically weighted in whatever the order of the day is. So it's keeping that balance between what do your political people want, what's good for the people who are in prison, and for all the various publics there are, the media, prisoners' families, victims' families, keeping all of those things organised is the governor's role, and probably why I left. It's it's also part of the civil service, so there's all of the sort of functional rules within that. Psychotherapist, I see as much more able to focus on one area, one contribution. And I think that contribution is helping prisoners to make the changes that they want to make, um, and stick with that change of mindset, not just suppress the anger they may have at society, but helping them not have that anger. So helping them to do that is the role of psychotherapy. And in terms of being a colleague to operational staff, I think psychotherapists, part of your training is to stand back and look at the bigger picture. So to be the person that says that, I mean, we're doing it at the moment. What's different about coming back with the pandemic? What do we need to think of? How has this impacted on people? Won't there be obvious anger? Where's that getting displaced to? So, if you're trying to run a prison, focusing on that as well, I think is not so. So offering that as a contribution, but not seeing it again as better or more important, but that it is an important part. Psychologists, I don't know, but.
And what is it like trying to rebuild the therapeutic regime after the pandemic in a residential service like a therapeutic community? I imagine that it's a big challenge, because you're not at the start of something where you've got all the enthusiasm and resources that go with a startup project.
And you're traumatized. I mean, if you think of trauma, I think one definition is sort of a thing that threatens life or perceived way of life, psychologically or physically. Then, you mentioned earlier, David, that Grendon's been going for 60 years. I don't think in any of that time has it had to cease therapy for six months total, and then we could get little bits back and things. So, that is, and to staff who are working there, that is what they came in to do, and they couldn't do it. So they had to lock people up, which is what they moved away from, wanting to work in a therapeutic community. So of course it's difficult to get back. And I think it will be for some time. The only support, I was going to say weapon, gives you an idea of what I'm feeling, but is to raise that awareness and to keep raising that awareness and to say it's difficult. How the hell can it not be difficult? So let's not beat ourselves up for not being able to do this, and to know that it will take time, and pat ourselves on the back for what we have done. I mean, people lost family members, people lost a sense of who they are. For some of the men in Grendon, they just started in therapy and then it was locked down. And I often think that, a lot of their early trauma in life for the prisoners was just do as I say because I'm saying it. And some of that was, and go to your room. And what we did in pandemic was say, you do it because I say to it, go to yourself. And that can't not have triggered some memories and therefore the responses and the defenses to that. So, yeah, I think.
Yeah, although of course one might say that much of the difficulty that we have in running a prison service is because so much of it is kind of subterranean. So the public can happily complain about prisoners being fed luxury meals and having big screen televisions and PlayStations without knowing anything about the real conditions of being in a prison.
Yeah, my late husband used to say prison is as punishment, not for punishment. You go to prison as punishment, not for it.
Quite, yeah. So, Mary, we've touched upon, but not really gone into that other major group of staff who exercise power and influence, sometimes in a covert manner, the prison officer group. How does the work that you do impact upon them?
Well, positively, I hope. You know, Grendon has, and I'm assuming other therapeutic communities, much less incidents of assaults and difficulties. So it I think the work that all therapeutic units do actually helps people to see their role much more holistically and to work relationally, as we were talking about before. I think prison officers are very often underrated, um, seen in a very one-dimensional way, and I I find working with prison officers, even as a governor grade, really helpful and illuminating. I like working with prison staff. As a governor grade, there were some arguments between management and unions, but there was always the people behind that. So for me, I think therapeutic work in prisons can only be an enhancement. I know that the Women's Prison Service adopted trauma-informed working across the whole prison women's estate. And I'm sure there were some dissenting voices, but I never heard of any. I heard that people just found it was much better to work in that way. Staff that I've spoken to in Grendon and in other therapeutic community prisons, again, all said the same thing. This actually enhances my work rather than makes it more difficult.
Thank you. So I think you've changed your work recently, haven't you? What's your new role?
Well, I'm clinical training and development manager, and it's part-time, which is very exciting for me after all these years. Um, so I there's a special in-house training course, which is 3 lots of 3 days for all staff, multidisciplinary, coming to work in prison-based therapeutic communities. And it's called TCAT, which is Therapeutic Community Accredited Training. And it's accredited by the Prison Service Therapeutic Community Department, which works with the OPD. And so I'm updating all of those, and I'm starting to, I've done a few of the first level, and I'm just loving it. It's really great. Again, that creativity side of it, you can update things. You can spout off some of your own ideas, provided that they're within the framework. And it's lovely working with other prisons that are doing the same thing. And again, that's why I'm so careful to not say it's just Grendon, because I think that we all learn so much from each other. So there's that, but I'm also introducing some other developmental ideas at Grendon, which is where I'm based, for staff, for prison officers, for people coming in at a wing psychotherapist or wing psychologist when it's not prison trained, or wing therapist, to learn more about the prison service. So you can come in as a wing therapist from the NHS or private sector and have people talk to you about PSIs and what the OMU and a sentence plan, and you're going, I think I should know this, so I better shut up. But actually, you don't. So what I'm running, just starting, is a familiarity thing. I'm just working with our senior probation officer now to get that going. What's all this? How does this work? So that, again, it's back to that joining clinical and operational staff, really trying to increase the common ground. So,
Yeah, it sounds great, and you bring so many years of experience to bear upon that. Were you going to say something, Naomi?
Well, echoing that, really, how good it would be to have that kind of orientation when you go into work in a prison. Can you hear me?
we lost you.
Oh, so I was just echoing you, David, in that how fantastic to have that access to an orientation programme to enable you to have familiarity with the various concepts that are used in prison, the various terms, and even I remember that term MDT, obviously in the NHS means multidisciplinary team, but in the context of a prison is mandatory drug test. So, to eliminate those kind of confusions, I'm sure it'd be really valuable, your training.
I mean, what's really good as well is the governor at Grendon is 100% behind, and she suggested. So I feel that we're getting, that leadership from the top that says, yes, this is the way we want to go. So I'm really lucky, really pleased.
Good. So Mary, you come across as being fairly bouncy and energetic, and yet you've chosen to work in a really challenging field for over 20 years. How do you keep yourself well and in balance?
It's over 30 years.
Sorry.
Well, I'm not sure I am well balanced, but they haven't caught me yet. It's people, family, it's friends. It's a good glass of wine. And a member of my family once said to me, "You love a good course, don't you?" I'm always looking on doing new courses, and a lot of those are work-based. But currently, I'm doing an art class, which is every Thursday of the week, looking at all different things. And I'm also partway through a 2-year energy healing course, which I describe as being a cross between quantum physics and being an aging hippie. So it's all about this whole quantum energy field and how what intention you put in makes a difference and this sort of thing. So it's that and fun. Oh God, I really like to have a laugh. Sometimes quite sarcastically, and so I have to bite my tongue. But yes.
Yeah, I think your positivity really does come across, and I love that phrase, you live a good course, Mary, and you should start your own podcast. I feel like I've been able to develop my own CPD program over the last 18 months.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Mary. Is there anything you'd like to say to finish off?
No,
you don't have to.
I mean, I will. No, thank you. And I hope I've done justice to it. I really do. So thank you.
Well, you've certainly done justice to yourself, which was the whole point.
I think people will enjoy that conversation.
Thank you.